Hey students, welcome to History 18. This is the first lecture for this class and it corresponds with chapter 15 of your textbook. Today we are going to talk about Reconstruction, and Reconstruction is a really tumultuous time in U.S. history. It is the time period immediately following the American Civil War. So let's get started. Here you have your key terms. These are your guideposts through this lecture. So you're going to want to look at these key terms and make sure that for each of these key terms, you know two primary things. Number one, the definition, what is it? And number two, how is it important in the broader context of U.S. history? If you can answer those two questions about the key terms, then you're going to be well on your way to doing very well on a quiz or an exam. All quiz and exam materials are based on these key terms. So I present the key terms because I know for students it's difficult sometimes, particularly in history. There's so much information out there that it's really nice to be able to have kind of a guidepost. What do I want you to know as the instructor? So this is your key terms. I will list them at the beginning of each lecture. Again, use these as your guideposts. Make sure that you have a notepad ready to go to take notes from this lecture. So this is the United States in 1860. This is right before the onset of the Civil War. You can see those states there in orange. Those are the southern states. Those are the slave states. And then you see the states there in green. Those are the free states. Now, the issue before the Civil War was really all of those territories in between. Were they going to be slave? Were they going to be free? And there was a lot of dispute about this, both at the local levels, at the state levels, but also at the national level. And, a little mini civil war erupts in Kansas for 2 years. People are fighting back and forth over this issue. So it's really becoming tense. And when Abraham Lincoln is elected president in November of 1860, um, South Carolina decides to secede from the Union. And later on, they'll be joined by six more states by March of 1861. And then by April of 1861, 11 states will have seceded from the Union. Now, Abraham Lincoln saw these states as being in rebellion. He didn't never really recognize them as legitimate country, which is what they wanted to be. But when war does break out in April of 1861, you know, the basically states have to decide whether they're going to remain with the Union or they're going to secede. So 11 states will secede and become part of the Confederate States of America. No, I'm not going to talk about the Civil War in this lecture. I'm only going to focus on Reconstruction efforts during the war and after. But if we look at this map, you can gives you a sense of how the country was divided during the Civil War. So you see here those green states; those are going to be all the Confederate states. They considered themselves a separate country. The federal government considered them in rebellion. And then if you see those states there in that darker purple, those are states that are considered border states. They were slave states, but they chose not to secede. So there was a lot of fighting in those areas as well during the Civil War. And then you'll notice the states in pink. Those are the states that remain with the Union during the Civil War. And those are also free states. And then you see those territories there in that orange color. So 2 years of war have gone by. It's 1863, and Abraham Lincoln decides that it's time to start moving towards bringing the country back together. And so there are several things that he is going to do to try to move in that direction, even as the war is going on. So the first is issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. He does this on January 1st of 1863, and the Emancipation Proclamation is actually an official executive order. It was an order done during wartime, and the way that Lincoln presented it was that it was a military necessity. What he was trying to do was he was trying to add African Americans to the Union Army. So that was the first thing that he wanted to do because the military was constantly being depleted because these big Civil War battles, thousands of people would either die or get injured. And so the forces needed to constantly be replenished. So he knew that African American freed people would fight and fight hard. And that's exactly what happened. 186,000 former slaves will join the Union Army, and 38,000 of them will lose their life during over the course of the next 2 years of fighting. The Emancipation Proclamation is a very specific thing in that it says only the states that are currently in rebellion are required to free their slaves. So that at the time that this was issued, that was only 10 states. There were still other states with slavery in them. So the Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery in the United States. All it does is basically say that the slaves that are in the states in rebellion can become free. Now, in order to do this, obviously they would have to get up and leave the states that they were in and go over to the Union side. So you've got these, mass migrations of slaves trying to get off of the plantations, trying to get to the north. And as I said, 186,000 former slaves will join the Union forces. Now, what did the Emancipation Proclamation not do? It did not give freedmen citizenship. It did not outlaw slavery. And there were issues about whether or not former slave owners should be compensated for their loss because slaves were looked at as property. So there was a lot of sort of unanswered questions with the Emancipation Proclamation. But the purpose of it, in terms of for the Lincoln administration, was to, again, fill the ranks of the military with former slaves, but also to demoralize the South. The South was so accustomed to having their way of life with the slaves, the plantation owners relied upon them as a labor force. And this is going to sort of hit at the very core of the Southern economy. So it was a really important executive order, but I want to make it clear that it did not end slavery in the United States. It won't be until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that slavery will actually end. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January of 1863. And then in December of 1863, the Lincoln administration decides to take it a step further and basically come up with a plan for readmitting states in rebellion back into the Union. This is called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. It's also sometimes referred to as the 10% plan. Basically, what this does is it allows for states to be readmitted back into the Union if 10% of their voting population, and a voting population at this time would have been white males, 10% of their voting population swore an oath of allegiance to the United States. So there was this oath, this proclamation that they had to say. And once that the number of people that had said the oath in those states took it, 10%, then they could get readmitted back into the Union. Now, Southerners absolutely hated this oath. They had a nickname for it. They called it swallowing the dog because they could not stand saying it. And in fact, a lot of Southerners resented the fact that they had to say it because some of them were forced to say it in these POW camps. So it was very disingenuous. It wasn't like many of them were just saying it because they had to, not because they meant it. Um, and so a lot of people, especially members of Congress, did not like the 10% plan or the proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction because they didn't feel like it did enough. They wanted instead for the South to be punished, or at least for the South to have to go through a series of things in order to be readmitted back into the Union. They thought this plan was too easy. And the people that thought this plan was too easy were the radical Republicans. And two of their most famous leaders you see pictured here, Thaddeus Stephen and Charles Sumner. Um, they really wanted to see a complete transformation of Southern society before these Southern states get readmitted back into the Union. So, number one, they didn't trust the loyalty oaths. They thought that the proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, the 10% plan, they thought it didn't go far enough. They wanted to confiscate Confederate land and redistribute it amongst former slaves. This is the famous 40 acres and a mule plan that a lot that you might have heard of, where the idea was that you would redistribute Confederate land to former slaves. And each family would get 40 acres and a mule, and that would allow them to transition into self-sufficient lifestyle. They also wanted African Americans to have access to equal rights, including the right to own property. And this was very controversial for former slaves to have the right to own property or the right to vote. And so these radical Republicans, during the Lincoln administration, they're kind of a minority in Congress. But as we move on through Reconstruction, they are going to become more and more of a loud voice of opposition. And they're really going to push for freed people to have access to equal rights. Okay, so the final thing that the Lincoln administration does, and again, this is all happening during the Civil War. So the Civil War is still happening. The Lincoln administration's trying to figure out how do we incorporate freed people back into society and into the Union. So the final thing that the Lincoln administration does is create the Freedmen's Bureau. This is one of the most successful programs that is instituted during the Reconstruction period. It lasts only 5 years, from 1865 to 1870. Um, it was created right before the end of the Civil War in March of 1865. And basically, this is a federal agency. The Freedmen's Bureau is a federal agency, opens up agencies down in the South where Freedmen Bureau's agents, the people that are working for the federal government, are basically tasked with trying to aid former slaves. And they were doing this in a number of ways. One was to help with housing, to help with food, to help with land distribution, education, healthcare, employment contracts, because obviously once slavery is ended, you can no longer be a slave. So you have to have a contract for your employment that says how much money you are going to make, what type of hourly wage you are going to have, or what type of employment contract you're going to have. And in the case of a lot of former slaves, that will end up being a sharecropping contract. Um, the Freedmen's Bureau was a great agency. Unfortunately, it was always understaffed and underfunded because there was just so much need. But it did have two primary main achievements: education and healthcare. Freedmen's bureaus were able to set up something called Freedmen's schools during the time that it existed, and those schools will continue on. So they will become a very important institution for African Americans moving forward, and for many African Americans, a way out of poverty in the South. I mean, if they could afford to go to school, if they could afford to send their kids to school. But so that's another issue. But those education in those freedmen schools, they were a very important part of this transition during the Reconstruction period. Healthcare also, because keep in mind that slaves, for the most part, had little to no access to healthcare. And so it was very important to have clinics and places where former slaves could go to get medical care. So this is an image of a Freedmen Bureau agent trying to mediate a fight between a group of white Southerners and a group of freedmen. So these agents often got in the middle of these disputes. They were often the target of violence, especially by the Ku Klux Klan. Freedmen's agencies would basically sometimes be the target of vandalism, sometimes arson. So it was a very tense time, and I think that this lithograph really captures that moment. Okay, so in April of 1865, the war ends, and it ends with the unconditional surrender of the South to the North. And so here you see an image of, on your left hand side, you have General Ulysses S. Grant, and he's shaking the hand of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And this happens at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865. And this marks the official end of the American Civil War. When it's all said and done, over 650,000 Americans have died, which at that time represented 3% of the American population. Just 5 days after the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and he's assassinated on Good Friday, April 14th of 1865, at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The person who committed this act of violence is a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth. He was an actor at the theater, and he went there on a regular basis to pick up his mail. And he had gone to pick up his mail the day before and found out from the worker there that the president was going to be attending the play um, on that Friday evening. And the play was a play called My American Cousin. It was actually kind of ironically a comedy. And That night, Abraham Lincoln was supposed to also be accompanied by Ulysses S. Grant, but strangely, his wife had a very bad feeling about it and insisted that they didn't go. So instead, he was accompanied by Major General Hathborne and his fiancee, Clara. And so John Wilkes Booth had been plotting to assassinate Abraham Lincoln for quite some time. And he didn't just want to assassinate Lincoln. He wanted to assassinate Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's vice president. He wanted to assassinate the war secretary. He wanted to assassinate Ulysses S. Grant. So there was this big hit list. And so John Wilkes Booth got very excited when he found out that Lincoln would be attending the theater because he knew that he would have access to the theater. So he basically goes up, he's sitting outside of the VIP booth where Lincoln and his wife were seated. And he waits for a moment in the play where there's a big outburst of laughter. And so he can't be detected. And he waits for the laughter, and he opens up the door to the VIP booth and he bursts in and he shoots the president basically right behind his left, or excuse me, right ear, directly into his skull. He jumps from the balcony onto the stage and yells out to the crowd, Sic semperis tyrannis, meaning death to the tyrants. That's also the Virginia state motto. And then he limps off of the stage. He'd actually broken his leg by jumping down onto the stage, and people are confused. Mary Lincoln Todd is screaming because she realizes that her husband has just been shot. And there's this massive confusion, and actually, John Wilkes Booth manages to get away in the confusion. He's later on hunted down by some federal marshals and killed a couple of weeks later. But meanwhile, the president has been mortally wounded. And you can see here he will die the following morning, surrounded by his son and his wife and some of the uh, top advisors in the United States Congress. This is a major shock to a nation that has just gone through this horrific civil war and now has to move ahead with Reconstruction without their leader. So the country after the Civil War has just been hopelessly transformed. There is so much tension. As I mentioned earlier, over 500,000 Americans die in this war. 2%, I said three, okay, 2% of the population, which is a huge amount of people, meaning that most people that were alive at that time were somehow impacted by this war. And infrastructure has been destroyed in towns, in cities, private property. Um, a lot of the plantations in the South had been destroyed by the Union armies moving through. So there was a lot of anger, and it was going to be very difficult to bring the country together and to move forward. Okay, so after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes the next president. He is Abraham Lincoln's vice president, and he is also the only Southern Democrat to not have gone with the Confederacy. It's very interesting that Abraham Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate in the 1864 election, but it's not uncharacteristic of Abraham Lincoln because he was really at that point trying to pull the country together. And so I'm sure that he saw choosing Andrew Johnson as his running mate as a way to compromise between the North and the South. So when Andrew Johnson becomes president as a result of Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865, he really is somebody who is not interested in the types of Reconstruction that Abraham Lincoln was interested in. In fact, what he wanted was to not give any African Americans, freed people, any kind of rights. He refused to support the 14th Amendment, which would grant African Americans citizenship, and the 15th Amendment which would allow African Americans to vote, or pass an amendment that says people can vote regardless of race. So these were things that were on the table. Andrew Johnson was opposed to them. Instead, what he does is he comes along and he pardons most ex-Confederates. He returns confiscated lands to ex-Confederates. And he basically says, let's just make re-entry into the Union easy. So, as a result of the presidency of Andrew Johnson, things are going to go back to kind of business as usual in the South. And what's going to happen is you're going to get a bunch of states and municipalities basically passing discriminatory laws. And these laws are known generally as the Black Codes. Now, the Black Codes were specifically targeting African Americans and specifically former slaves. So these were actual laws on the books. Some of them actually remained on the books all the way until the 1960s, which explicitly did things like exclude African Americans from owning firearms or from consuming liquor. Sometimes they would add language to make it difficult for African Americans to vote. For serving on juries. African Americans were not allowed to serve on juries or testify in court. Interracial marriage was pretty much across the board all throughout the South outlawed. In addition to that, there were other things like employment taxes, which would be passed um, specifically to try to keep African Americans in agricultural work. So, for example, if an African American wanted to go and apply for a job as a woodworker or a blacksmith or any type of skilled labor, any kind of labor outside of the agricultural industry in the South, sometimes there would be an employment tax that would actually be added onto their application for those positions. So there was also other things called apprenticeship laws in which African American children were essentially told that they had to go in apprentice on the plantations, and this was basically free labor. It was a way for the plantation owners to continue this system of free labor. There were also very discriminatory clauses put into these Black codes, which would put restrictions on movement, on speech. Really vague language was often written in there so that law enforcement officials could essentially interpret the laws as much as they wanted so that they could, go and harass African Americans on the street, perhaps arrest them. And inevitably in these Black codes, another sort of insidious thing about them is that they would have written into them that as soon as an African American was arrested for breaking one of these, ridiculous laws, then you would be put in jail and fined. But if you couldn't pay the fine, then you could be hired out in order to carry out your fine or to pay off your fine or to carry out your sentence. And again, this was very much a way to create this revolving door that would go into the criminal justice system, out the other side for African Americans, and then right back into a position of servitude, essentially, or subjugation of some sort. It was really extremely unfair and continued, as I mentioned, all the way until we get into the 1960s. So the Black codes, and I actually will I'll try to post an example of what these Black codes would have looked like. I'll add that to the module so that you can kind of get a sense of what these types of laws were like and how unfair and also how discriminatory they really were. It is very shocking, but it's an extremely unfortunate episode in the history of specifically the South, because that's really where most of these laws were being passed. But keep in mind, there was really nothing from, preventing other states from passing laws. And what we're going to see moving forward is that violence against African Americans took place all over the country in the wake of the American Civil War. So keep that in mind moving forward. So one of the things that the radical Republicans wanted to do was they wanted to stop what was happening in the South because after Andrew Johnson takes office, as I've already mentioned, things are really going to go back to business as usual in the South. And African Americans are going to be discriminated against. They're going to be harassed. They're going to be threatened. And so the radical Republicans start to gain a majority in the House and Senate. So in the interim election of 1866, which is the election in between a presidential election, basically what happens is the Republicans will get a supermajority in the House and they will pass a series of acts. And these acts are collectively known as the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, or sometimes they're referred to as the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867. And the really important thing that these acts do, and I'm not going to go into specifics about each one, but basically what it does is it provides a protection for African Americans in the South by dividing the South into 5 military districts that federal troops would occupy. And the federal troops' jobs in these military districts was to ensure that African Americans were protected, particularly when they were in public spaces and when they were going to voter polling places so that they could cast their votes safely and without intimidation. The second major thing that the military presence was set out to do in the South was to make sure that each of the state legislatures would draft a constitution that guarantees African Americans have the right to vote, which is black suffrage, that's what you see on the slide, and ratify the 14th Amendment, which would give African Americans citizenship. So this was basically an act, several acts of Congress that was trying to force this issue on the southern states. So, as you can imagine, President Johnson, who had no interest at all in seeing African Americans have any kind of rights or power, he vetoed the act. But because the Congress had a supermajority, they were able to override his veto. And this is the first time that a presidential veto will be overridden in American history. You need a 2/3 majority in order to do that, both in the House and in the Senate, and they were able to get it. So even though the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 were vetoed by the president, meaning not signed into law, the Congress had enough votes to override that veto, and the military districts in the South will be put in place. And that's what you see here on this map. You see District 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and these are all military districts with a military presence. And again, that military presence is there to protect African Americans and also to ensure that in the state legislation, they will also have protections by the law. So now we're going to move on to talk about the Reconstruction Amendments. These are 3 constitutional amendments that were passed in a very short period of time over the course of just 5 years. This is extremely unusual for constitutional amendments to be added to the Constitution so quickly. It takes a very long time. It's a long process to pass a constitutional amendment. What you need in order to pass a constitutional amendment is a 2/3 majority in the House and in the Senate. And then you need to send those amendments out to each of the states. And then the legislators have to vote on that amendment. And in order for those amendments to pass, they need to have a 3/4 majority of the states voting in favor of the amendment. So it's a long process. It's a tedious process. It doesn't happen very often. And that's why the Reconstruction Amendments are so unusual. The other reason why the Reconstruction Amendments are important is because these are really some of the basic foundations of our civil rights in the United States. So let's move ahead to talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. We'll begin with the 13th Amendment. This was the first constitutional amendment to be passed, and it was passed in 1865. If you've ever seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, that's the story of the 13th Amendment getting passed by the Congress under the Lincoln administration. Unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed before he actually saw this amendment get ratified by the states. But it will get ratified eventually in 1865, and the 13th Amendment officially outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. That's an interesting little clause at the end there, except for punishment for a crime, because there still is, you can still basically force people to work, and there are prisons where prisoners do work here in the United States. Now, they don't do it completely for free, but typically they're paid, 25 cents a day or something like that. So for all intensive purposes, they're essentially working for free. And so there's this little loophole in this, but it does outlaw slavery and involuntary servitude, again, except as punishment for a crime. So this was a huge step forward in the history of the United States. The United States was, at the time that this passed, one of the last countries on the planet that officially allowed slavery. Okay, moving on to the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and this was passed in 1868, ratified in 1868. Now, this is a very long amendment, and you can actually read the amendment in the back of your textbook. It's in the appendix. But basically what you need to know about the amendment, I've put on this slide. These are kind of the highlights of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment essentially gives all people born or naturalized in the U.S. citizenship. Now, it does exclude one major group, and that's the Native Americans. The Native Americans will not get, at least all Native Americans will not get full citizenship until 1924. But everybody else born or naturalized in the United States will become citizens, and that is guaranteed by this amendment. It prohibits the states from abridging the privileges and immunities of citizens. So it's saying, look, you states can't make special laws that are going to take away privileges and immunities that are the sort of rights of these citizens, American citizens. Number 4, prohibits depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So you can't, take away somebody's right to a trial or a trial by jury, and all of those due processes that the law guarantees. And then finally, the 4th point there, it prohibits denying any person equal protection of the law. And even though seems like such a basic idea, this particular clause in the 14th Amendment will eventually become the basis of all civil rights legislation in the United States. And so it turns out that the 14th Amendment is actually one of our most powerful and influential constitutional amendments, and still to this day remains one of the most powerful amendments, and like I said, is the basis of all of the civil rights legislation, particularly the legislation that was passed in the 1950s and in the 1960s. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was the last one to be ratified of the Reconstruction amendments. It was ratified in 1870. And this prohibits the states from denying the right to vote on the grounds of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Now, that sounds great, right? And it is a good amendment. The problem is there's a major loophole in this amendment, and that's that it says it prohibits states from denying the right to vote on the grounds of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. It does not say anything about being able to prohibit somebody from voting if they cannot pay a poll tax or if they cannot pass a literacy test, right? So there are all of these loopholes in this law that Southern legislatures will exploit later on. As we get into later into the 19th century, into the 1800s, we are going to start to see these Southern legislators passing laws requiring that people pay poll taxes, requiring that people take literacy tests. And this, of course, is going to disenfranchise or make it very difficult for a lot of African Americans to cast their vote. So, how does this all impact African Americans, newly freed people living in the South after the Civil War? Well, instead of, this promise of autonomy and independence and potential political power and all of those things, unfortunately, a lot of African Americans were really forced into a cycle of poverty that was very difficult to get out of. And on top of that, of course, they faced major amounts of discriminatory laws, um, ways that they were prevented from voting through disenfranchisement laws. And so, unfortunately, even though Reconstruction and the Reconstruction era does offer this like brief little glimpse of hope for African Americans, once the Reconstruction era ends, and we're going to talk about how that happens at the end of this lecture, it is going to be very difficult for African Americans, and they will be facing, again, increased discrimination. But let's talk about life for African Americans after slavery. Well, for most African Americans, they moved right from being enslaved to participating in the sharecropping economy. Now, sharecropping was not just for African Americans. There were a lot of poor Southern whites that also engaged in sharecropping. And basically, what sharecropping is that you work a piece of land for your landlord, and you give that landlord half of your crop in exchange for rent. And that's essentially what it is. Now, for a lot of former slaves, that landlord was their former slave owner. That was their master. And so they were then still living on the same, plantation. They might not be, in the slave quarters. They might be living in a smaller plot of land away from the house and everything, but they still would be living on the plantation where they were enslaved, working for their now landlord, and having to give that landlord half of whatever crop they managed to produce on that plot of land. So that's sharecropping, and sharecropping was extremely common in the South, and it lasted well into the 20th century. And it really wasn't until right around World War II, in the 1940s, that sharecropping really starts to decline significantly. So this is a very long-lasting institution in the South after the end of slavery. But what I really want you to know about is something that is happening in the South after the Civil War, in addition to sharecropping, and that's the Southern crop lien system. So, like sharecropping, the Southern crop lien system also, in some cases, applied to poor Southern whites. So, African American freed people, poor Southern whites, they were both dealing with these systems of really, really horrible poverty conditions. But For sharecroppers, if you happen to be a sharecropper, um, this crop lien system becomes a really difficult thing, and I'm going to explain to you why. So basically, you are a sharecropper, and your harvest comes in, right? And you give half of that harvest to your landlord. Well, throughout the year, while you were growing that crop, you needed goods to buy, right? But you didn't have any money because you're not a wage earner, you're not making any money. You're basically a farmer, right? So you needed supplies, maybe you needed tools, maybe you needed cloth or to make clothing, maybe you needed some shoes, maybe you needed some bag of rice so that your family could eat, whatever you needed. So what sharecroppers would do in that case, because they had no actual cash or money, is they would go down to a local merchant, to a store, and that merchant would give them goods on a lien, on a crop lien. Okay. So when that harvest came in and the sharecropper was expected to give 50% of that harvest to the landlord, guess who they had to give the other 50% to? The store owner, right? And so when that happened, that sharecropper now is left with absolutely nothing. And so they have to start that cycle all over again. So if you were a sharecropper and you had to use the crop lien system, it was like a 1-2 punch. Every single time your harvest came in, you would inevitably be left with nothing, and you would then be stuck having to do the whole cycle over again. So this is how those cycles of poverty continued in the South, and how they continued for so long and for so many generations. So we can see that economically things were pretty bad for African Americans after the Civil War. Not a lot of opportunity. The laws were against them. The laws, in many ways, forced them to stay in this agricultural work, but the agricultural work, forced them into a cycle of poverty, sharecropping in the crop lien system, etc. But for some African Americans, there was a glimmer of hope and some opportunity, and that was inevitably provided through these African American schools that were popping up in the South after the Civil War. Keep in mind that if you were an enslaved person, it was illegal for you to learn how to read and write. And so many of these families were very hungry for knowledge and wanting to get educated, and really especially wanting to educate their kids. And so the Freedmen's Bureau, which we talked about earlier, pops up, and they are providing education, mostly like elementary through like 8th grade kind of education. But as time goes on and those children get older, there's going to be more higher institutions of learning that are going to emerge in the South. And today we have over 100 historically Black colleges in the South. All of them started as these freedmen schools. Some of these schools were funded by the government, but the government had limited resources here. So a lot of these schools were privately funded either through church groups or charitable organizations. But this was really an important opportunity for so many African American, especially children, in the South after the American Civil War. Some of our, really important African American activists in the late 19th century, like Ida B. Wells, like Booker T. Washington, they all went to these freedmen schools, and that's what gave them that basic education that they needed in order to really, move up in the world and really make a difference and become activists within their community. Okay, so although that there are some opportunities for African Americans, the road ahead is tough. And one of the reasons why is because the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization, will emerge in the South after the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan forms in Biloxi, Tennessee in 1886. They are basically a very small group at first of ex rebels or ex Confederates. Many of them, it was said, had been forced to swallow the dog, say that oath of allegiance to the United States, and they were very mad about that. They felt that the South had been humiliated. They felt that the South had been treated unfairly. They had all of these complaints, and they would get together and they would have, these sort of meetings where they would talk about how the South would rise again, and that eventually, the North would pay for the oppression that it had put on the Southern states. And this message begins to spread all throughout Tennessee. And this is a very appealing message to a lot of people, especially ex Confederates. And these were fraternal organizations, so it was men only. That will change with the Ku Klux Klan as it gets into the 20th century. It starts to include women and children, and actually grows significantly in numbers. But in these early years, it was just a fraternal organization. And like I said, mostly former Confederate soldiers. As you can see from the slide, by 1868, there are dozens of these Ku Klux Klan chapters throughout Tennessee. And eventually they will elect what they call a Grand Wizard, a man by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate general and from a cavalry regiment in the Confederacy, famous general. And he basically, leads them to talking about how there's going to be this massive Southern army that's going to ride again. Now, there were two types of Ku Klux Klan members in these early years of the Ku Klux Klan. Um, there was one type who just wanted to see the South sort of avenge the North and wanted to see the Confederacy rise again. So another secession, essentially. There were others who really targeted African Americans in a very sick and twisted and violent way. And those were the people that often would carry out the night rides. The night rides were actually kind of a remnant of the days of slavery. So during the days of slavery, oftentimes overseers, people that worked on the plantations to oversee the slaves, they would go out at night and they would try to get, they were like on slave patrol, and they would try to catch slaves that might be sneaking out or might be going out to, meet or congregate in secret, or maybe there might be slaves that are just simply running away. And so these night riders would go out, and oftentimes they would put sheets over themselves and they would try to disguise themselves like spirits, because they thought that African Americans were very superstitious when it came to ghosts, and that this would be very terrifying for them. So the night rides get taken up by the Ku Klux Klan, and it's kind of like a leftover of these night rides from the days of slavery. Another thing that used to happen on these night rides was the cross burnings. So the cross burnings, they would go and burn crosses in the yards of African Americans. Sometimes they would burn crosses in front of African American churches. And of course there was lots of intimidation and sometimes just straight up violence, beatings, killings, lynchings. It was very, very brutal. The Ku Klux Klan also was interested in removing any kind of political power from African Americans. And so, even though the state legislatures were being forced through the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 to allow African Americans to vote, the Ku Klux Klan was really trying to stop that from happening. So they would go to polling places and try to intimidate African Americans, etc. So unless there were federal troops stationed at those polling places protecting those African Americans and allowing them to go in there and cast their vote, they basically were under a constant threat of intimidation from these Ku Klux Klan. So here you have some images of these early Klan groups. You can see that it's not really kind of what we think of, I guess, when we think of the Ku Klux Klan and the white robes. That's more of a 20th century thing, and we will be talking in this class about the Ku Klux Klan in the 20th century, specifically in the 1920s. But the older sort of uniforms often had more of like modified Confederate uniforms. That's what you see over there on the right. And then you also see sometimes some robes and some masks over. They also would sometimes ride around with masks with horns on them, sort of like devil looking masks. So again, the whole purpose being to intimidate. Um, as this terrorist organization grows in number and popularity, they're not necessarily doing this to hide their identity. They are just doing this to try to be intimidating, right? So that's the purpose of the masks. So as I mentioned already, and I want to emphasize that the Ku Klux Klan, as it moves along in time after it's formed, within 5 years or so, is carrying out really horrific acts of violence. Sometimes this would just include, intimidation, like you see this image right here of this African American gentleman at the polling place, and he's trying to cast his ballot, but he is essentially being forced to vote in a particular way by people who are there to intimidate him. Murder, of course, was always a threat. Beatings, arson, and assassination. Um, and there was also lynchings. And now I'm going to show an image that's really disturbing, and it's an actual photograph of an African American man being lynched. Um, Lynching and the history of lynching in the United States is something that we as a nation are just kind of coming to terms with in terms of acknowledging the fact that this happened for a very long time in United States history, and for a very long time, people got away with it. So basically, what lynching is when a vigilante group, okay, not commissioned by law enforcement, official law enforcement, although sometimes, unfortunately, members of lynch mobs are law enforcement officials or have been in the past. But basically you've got this vigilante group, and this vigilante group goes out and accuses an individual of committing some type of crime. And without that individual being able to have a day in court or get a lawyer or be tried by a jury of their peers or any of the normal processes of law, that person is hung or lynched. And this will sometimes happen in remote places and privately, kind of more like a secret or a murder. But in other instances, people are lynched in public places, almost like a party. And, people would gather there and, people would get lynched and then people would take pictures. Sometimes there would be, postcards that were sold. So I'm going to show the image right now. It is a very disturbing image. One of the things about this class is that there are a lot of disturbing images moving forward in sometimes in this history, and we're going to be looking at these things, but we're going to contextualize it. It's just really important to look history in the face. So this is an image, and again, one of the reasons why we have so many images of lynchings is because these images were oftentimes sold as souvenirs. And so, it's gotten out in the public, and so we still have a lot of these images. But as I was mentioning, lynching was a huge, huge problem in the United States. In some cases, you're talking about, I know, 188 lynchings per year in the 1880s. And that's just a conservative statistic. Lynchings continue in U.S. history all the way into the 20th century. And the unfortunate part about it is that in most cases, the people that committed these acts of violence never were prosecuted for their crimes. And so that makes it especially heinous. Okay, so African Americans were definitely targets of violence, especially in the South. But there were two other groups that were targeted for violence as well, especially by the Ku Klux Klan. There were carpetbaggers, and these were ex-Union soldiers who stayed in the South for whatever reason. They were considered opportunistic. Maybe they came to the South in order to make some money after the Civil War and try to exploit the fact that their economy had been ruined. So those are carpetbaggers, and then scallywags, and scalawags are the Republican Southerners, and these would have been, Republican Southern politicians that would have supported the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. They would have maybe spoken out against the Confederacy, spoken out against the war generally, and that was very much looked down upon. So I have this image of a carpet bag because I always think, wow, what I wonder if people wonder what a carpet bag is. Well, a carpet bag is actually a bag made out of carpet. So folks back then they didn't waste anything, and so everything was used, and there it is, a carpet bag. Okay, so Andrew Johnson is not a popular president, as you can imagine. In fact, he was actually impeached during his term. He wasn't removed from office, but he was impeached by the House, and he was just one vote shy of being removed from office in the Senate. And so by the time the end of his term his term had expired in 1868, he wasn't even going to run for the presidency because he knew that he had no chance of winning. So the Republicans will nominate the very famous Civil War general Ulysses S. Grant as their candidate in the election of 1868. And the Democrats will nominate Horatio Seymour. And these two will kind of face it off. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was hugely popular, especially in the northern states. And he also was very much a friend to Reconstruction. He really wanted to see Reconstruction efforts move forward. He didn't have a problem with African Americans gaining rights. He believed that African Americans should have the right to vote. And so, with the help of the African American vote in the South, Ulysses S. Grant will become the 18th president and will take office in 1869. After Grant takes office, Reconstruction will really take off. Grant will serve two terms as the president, and under his watch, the federal troop force will continue to remain in the South. And because of that, African Americans were coming out in large numbers and voting in the South. Now, in certain parts of the South, African Americans outnumber whites. And so if African Americans can get out and vote, then that makes a huge difference with the electorate. So one of the most amazing things about the era of Reconstruction is that during this era, over 2,000 African Americans occupied offices, public offices at all levels. So you're talking about senators, you're talking about Congress people, you're talking about mayors of towns, you're talking about members of state legislatures, all of these different levels of political city council people, right? All of these different levels of political power, African Americans are going to get elected to during Reconstruction due to the fact that African Americans were able to go out and cast their vote because they were protected by those federal troops. You see an example of some of these African American politicians here in these images. So pictured clockwise from upper left are Blance Bruce, who was a senator, Robert Smalls, Robert B. Elliott, both of them being congressional officials. And Robert Elliott, the one you see pictured on the bottom, he was actually an enslaved person, as was Robert Smalls. So could you imagine having been an enslaved African American and then getting elected to a public office where you have political power and you represent the people of your district? I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Unfortunately, when Reconstruction ends, African Americans will not be represented in the United States Senate until the 1960s. And still to this day, there has only been 6 African American senators, some of whom are still serving today. So this says a lot, right? At one point during Reconstruction, there were 2 senators from the state of Mississippi. Both were Black. So both of their senators were Black. So it really shows a lot about the power of the vote and the power of the electorate. Okay, so if President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's presidency really represents the height of Reconstruction, the beginning of the end of Reconstruction starts with the election of 1876. So there are 2, Grant has served 2 terms, so he steps down as president. And in his place, Rutherford B. Hayes will be the Republican candidate, and Samuel Tilden will be the Democratic candidate. And the main issue at hand was reforming the Reconstruction policies. A lot of people were getting, asking themselves, how long are we going to have federal troops in the South? Is this still an issue? Shouldn't we instead put our energy towards other things, et cetera, et cetera? So there's this debate back and forth. And to make matters worse, the election results were disputed. There was some dispute on the vote count for the Electoral College. And so a 15-member electoral commission is created to determine what the outcome of the election of 1876 will be. So they debate it, and they debate it all throughout the winter. And, because the election is in November, they're debating it throughout the winter. And finally, January rolls around, and the election committee comes out with the commission comes out with their decision, and their decision is Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate. Now, this was not an easy decision. There were a lot of Southern Democrats on the Electoral Commission. So in order for Hayes to become the next president, he makes a deal, and he makes a deal with the Southern Democrats. The deal that he makes is collectively known as the Bargain of 1877, sometimes called the Compromise of 1877. So what is it? Basically, Hayes is declared the winner of the election, okay? But behind the scenes, he has negotiated a bunch of things with these Southern Democratic politicians. The first is that he would recognize Democratic political control of the South, okay? That he wouldn't try to, disrupt that. Um, he also promises to help support a Southern Postmaster General and to promote a Southern Transcontinental Railroad, which the South really wanted. They wanted their own transcontinental railroad because the North got their transcontinental railroad completed in 1869. We'll be talking about that too. Hayes promises federal support to rebuild the South. So the South still had a lot of levees that had been destroyed as a result of the war, train tracks that had been destroyed, roads and other buildings and things that had been destroyed as a result of the war. And they wanted federal dollars to help rebuild that. But then significantly, and this is really the final blow to Reconstruction, is that Hayes orders federal troops to stop guarding the state houses, meaning that federal troops are basically told that they can leave the South, that they could go home. And the problem with this is that as soon as the federal troops are removed from the South, African Americans are left vulnerable to the Southern legislatures, vulnerable to the Ku Klux Klan, and vulnerable to all of the discriminatory laws that have been passed against them. And so this spells the end of Reconstruction. And so, Reconstruction, this very brief, relatively brief moment in American history, basically beginning in 1863 with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, will end in 1877 with the bargain of 1877 and the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes. That's it.